Architecture, urbanism, and musical instruments have had a love affair for quite a long time. We can first see that in the bell tower and the bell. The bell started off kind of small, but as it grew larger and larger, new infrastructure was needed to support it. And this is kind of the first time that a musical instrument actually kind of directs the growth and form of architecture. You end up getting bell towers everywhere and becomes a form that is highly recognizable, especially in pre-industrial cities where people lament about the loss. There's a period of time where people are writing about the loss of bell towers and the erasure of them with the rise of skyscrapers and other things. There's poetry, there's songs that come about because of the bell tower. And it's kind of an interesting way that the musical instrument has influenced architecture. Another gigantic musical instrument is the pipe organ. Again, something that kind of started off relatively small, but then as space of cathedral started to expand and become much more complex, these technology increased a lot. These things started to grow huge, and there's thousands of pipes in these. These create their own structure. They become ornamental. They're very spatial. They start to occupy architecture in a totally different way. They start to fill it up. They occupy the spaces between columns. They fill in apses. They create their own rooms. And this is a little bit different than like a bell tower because they actually become their own architectural element. They're almost like their own kind of building, whereas the bell is a pretty simple construct, but required, super heavy, so it required a huge amount of architecture to support it. More recently, there's been a lot of kind of sculptural musical instruments that are gigantic. There's wind harps in lots of locations. This is an example of a sea organ. It's built in Croatia, and it kind of melds together infrastructure, urbanism, landscape, architecture, ecology into one kind of giant creation. And the mechanism for the instrument is hidden. You can kind of just see, there's a few moments where in this detail you can see how the sound might enter or exit. And it's all powered by the wind and the sea, so the waves change the melody and the wind as well. All of these are kind of examples of huge, large-scale musical instruments. I think they're all super fascinating, but I'm interested in something a little bit different. I think for me, these are a little bit too passive. It's really about kind of things out of your control, kind of changing it. Like, for example, this one, the wind, or there's a musician behind with a pipe organ that's playing it. But I'm much more interested in, and I could have put up any image here, but and we've seen today how musical instruments and music really get people to interact in ways that they normally don't, or it really begins to create moods. And as you can see, there's a bagpipe player here. It's really about kind of the way that the instrument and the body kind of come together and how that relationship can actually create different moods and how a love affair can occur on the other side or right next to him. And so it's about really trying to use these objects to transform the way that people behave in space and creating new spatial relationships. So I'm an architect, and I call myself an architectural breeder because most of the materials that we usually work with are living in some sort of way. We also call ourselves a farm, not a firm, because of this. We're constantly, as you'll see, we're constantly working with living material. This was a amphitheater that we recently finished that was made completely out of hay. This is outside of Chicago. And it's a temporary structure. It's only supposed to be up for about 5 months. I think it'll be coming down pretty soon here. But the idea is that we'd be building out of hay, which is a biodegradable material, but it would also be able to support life. And throughout the summer, it's been growing various prairie plants, mushrooms, squirrels have set up homes in it. So at one point, it's constantly growing, but it's also decaying, and it will soon be completely gone. This was a pinata that we did. This was we have a few projects that kind of are based off of living beings. This was a pregnant pinata that happened to have some babies, but it was also, we kind of reinterpreted what the candy interior would be, and this is caramelized sugar for blood. And we kind of imagined that this was a thing that it kind of has its own life, and that children would maraud it and try and get at its sugary interior. We also designed plush toys, again, kind of working with living elements or kind of giving objects that are normally inanimate or don't have like their own sort of stories. We try and give them stories. So this was kind of, we would design these elements, we would manufacture them, and we gave them a life. So on this side, you can see how they are born, and then there's actually some, this is a mother and child, so there's an idea about how the two objects interact together. This idea of carrying also carries out into a different sort of object. This is a pillow of loneliness, and it was designed as a surrogate. So if maybe you broke up with your lover or your lover is on vacation, this is a pillow that can substitute and be there for you when you need that comfort. And it's designed to have like a giant floppy head that's pretty heavy over a soft body, so you can locate the head on your chest or wherever, and it provides the comfort that your lover would normally provide. So those are some aspects of living. The other thing that we've been more recently interested in is the act of breathing, and trying to give inanimate objects, well, when you allow inanimate objects to breathe, they start to have a different quality. And how this, so we started to make a bunch of objects that breathe, and this brings us to my current interest in bagpipes. Again, I'm an architect, not a musician, so I have very different interests in musical instruments than most other people would. And there's a few things about it that I find fascinating, kind of just the complexity of it, but also just the way that it transforms the human body. The player kind of hugs this thing, squeezes it, but their mouth and their face just becomes kind of a bloated giant thing. They come in different shapes, different sizes. And so from just an architectural point of view, kind of fascinated with just the shape of the bag. These are some of our own creations with kind of typical historical forms. This is what it looks like when you just draw a pattern of the bag. This is what they might look like if you create them out of fabric and start to hang them. So they have a different, totally different form when they're kind of physicalized and when they're uninflated. Then we inflate the forms to see how radically different that is and inflate it with different materials. And then this was a study of what happens when you combine multiple of these elements together to create some sort of bagpipe landscape. So kind of some of these studies ended up leading into a seminar that I conducted with 9 students over the course of 2 days. They were architecture students. None of them had any experience making bagpipes. None of them, they hardly even knew what went into making a bagpipe. And so 2 days was kind of short for doing this, but they actually achieved some amazing things. And the main goal of this was, I wasn't really expecting them to make sound. I was really expecting them to kind of make an object that was tactile, that they would be able to relate to each other in ways that they wouldn't normally experience. So after the second day, or the first day, one of the groups, it's a 5-person team, came up with kind of this scheme. Looks like a giant crab or something, but it's a multi-lobed bagpipe. And they ended up designing it so that they could all blow into the same bagpipe, which is kind of amazing. I've never seen that before, where 5 people are blowing into the same bladder. And it also was just kind of set up a new relationship between the people. They were all facing each other. They're all playing. They're all squeezing this thing. They're all blowing. And then, so this is what they kind of created. So it doesn't necessarily sound like a bagpipe. That wasn't the point. I mean, they ended up making like a zoo. It was amazing. There was monkeys, there were whales, and we actually happened to play in a space that we weren't anticipating was like the most amazing space for this weird instrument. The reverberation was amazing. But the primary thing about this was just that these people, they were interacting in ways that they normally wouldn't. They were creating objects that they normally wouldn't, and they were totally engaged with this thing because it was squealing, it was making all these sounds, and they were capable of manipulating it. And this kind of idea of interactivity comes across in some of our other projects. This was a pavilion that we built out on Governor's Island. It was a pavilion that was supposed to be played with, not necessarily in the musical sense, but it was designed as a bunch of inflatables that we knew that these things are tactile, these things are constantly changing, that people are going to want to touch them, they were going to want to play with them. Kids were constantly out there banging around with it. Everyone, like adults, would cuddle with it. There was all sorts of different interpretations of how to interact with this thing. And the inflatable canopy itself also changed dramatically over the summer. It kind of took on its own characteristics. It started off as a very simple form that, because of the weather, pressure, all these different forces that were going on at Governor's Island, the form actually began to change. And the portion that we didn't really anticipate was that important to the design, which was the butt of the creature, started to grow and became extremely big. So it was kind of interesting that people were interacting with this thing in a different way, but also this pavilion was transforming over time, which is kind of a rare thing for architecture to do, to allow it to just kind of change and adapt to different situations. Then finally, a last project that we did, which was a pavilion that we built in Union Square. These are the concept renderings for it. It was basically, again, this one was more closely related to a bagpipe. It was a giant inflatable donut that had a canopy of leaves above it. But it kind of worked in a totally opposite way of how a bagpipe would work. The inflatable portion, or on the bottom, was actually a sound absorber. And it was kind of incredible, so that when you would crawl into this thing, even though you were in the middle of Union Square, you wouldn't hear anything surrounding you. And it created like a totally different world. And so it was also interesting when people would go in there, would do things that you wouldn't normally feel that comfortable doing in a public space. And was kind of one of the joys of it. Also, when working with inflatables and with air, there's kind of a super quick timeline that you can build with. You get maximum volume from minimum means. We ended up having to carry 2 of these on the airplane, and it was no issue. So it was able to be transported all over the place. And so, kind of in closing, this is what it looks like in in Union Square, surrounded by hundreds of people. Kind of back to this image being that, I think that the most powerful architecture is the architecture that gets people to engage with it in ways they wouldn't normally expect, or to get people to behave differently than what is typical. And I think music and instruments do the same thing, and the way that music charges the environment, like we were seeing earlier today, and that I think the two can work together to make very powerful interactive architecture in spaces. Thanks.